My guest this month is Arelia Valdivia. It's a badass organizer. So we're just gonna jump right into it with the first two questions that I always ask. First, Arelia, um, how do you identify? Are you Latino, Hispanic, like Chicano, like Latinx? Like what? Who are you?
None of the above. Chicana. You were close.
Chicano.
I identify as Chicana. I grew up that, or I'm or Mexican, just straight up Mexican. But I grew up like my parents really wanted me to know that I was Mexican, and so like they always told me you're Mexican. So I would tell people I was Mexican, and then I finally met like people like friends who were born in Mexico, and then when I told them I wasn't, they're like, "You're not Mexican," and I felt like a real crisis coming on. And then I went to college, and they're like Chicanos exist, and I've identified as Chicana ever since. And also, like if you've ever taken a Chicano studies class, like the introduction to like the ideology and what it means, and like really self-identification. So yeah, that's primarily it. I will still sometimes tell people I identify as Mexican and still get some shit for it, but it's either Mexican or Chicana. I have like some weird issue with Mexican American. I don't know.
Mhm.
It just like feels weird, but yeah, that's. And what was the second question?
Well, no, yeah, that's the second one is just sort of the um, if you could give us your organizing history, like your resume, right? Like from the first thing, like if it was in college or before then, like what's the first thing you got involved in, and kind of walk us through where you're at now.
All right. So this is long. I will try to not be that long.
Yeah.
I will say so the I also should say that I'm trying to get into the habit of when people ask me how I identify to also include my gender identity. So like also identify as a cisgendered mujer. I feel I have more and more friends in the trans community. I feel like it should not be their obligation to give their pronouns only. And so if we normalize it, it makes it better. And the first thing I ever did, I was in high school and I joined this group called the LGBTSA, which is the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, uh, Straight Alliance. And I identify as straight, but my very, very good friend, still my good friend to this day, was queer and not out, and I knew that, and knew that they were having a hard time talking about it. And I joined kind of as like cover, like very much a beard, and it was like, come on and join with me, because I wanted them to be in community with other queer people and see if that helped them get past that. And it did. So that was the first thing ever. I was in high school. I still was not like, I grew up in a very non-politicized place in the Inland Empire, which is like an hour and a half southeast of Los Angeles. And then went to school, and then I got involved in METOO, and that was really where my activism began. And it really started as like me doing a lot of like organizing on campus about getting underrepresented communities into college. I always tell people I have 101 cousins. I do have 101, maybe more now, but I at the last time I counted them, there were 101. And of my dad's side, I'm like one of maybe 10 that went to college. My mom's side, which is the bigger side, which is like 80. I was the only one of my first cousins who went to college. And so a lot of what I wanted to do was figure out why that was happening. And so I did a lot of organizing through METOO around like getting people into higher education. And then METOO like helped me further politicize me. We got involved with like at the time our campus workers were fighting for a new contract. I was also working as a student with them. And so it was like my coworkers who were fighting for a new contract for raises and stuff. And so I got involved a little bit with that, but not that much. And then when I graduated from college, I didn't know what I was going to do because I graduated really young. I was 20. And I got this internship for the summer organizing back in my hometown, organizing warehouse workers. And I thought I was going to do it for a summer, and that was it. And I started talking to warehouse workers and realized that like a lot of the issues that I had growing up, and like a lot of the reasons why people in our community don't go to college is because of the types of jobs that our parents have, right? Like, or like people have to go to work to help their families, or their parents aren't around. Like my parents are great, but they worked all the time, right? And so I really like began to identify with the workers, and I was like, oh, this might be something that I want to do. And so I organized there for a year. And then I heard about the Hotel Workers Union. My director at the time was from that union, and I had heard about them when I was in college. Had heard about the famous Maria Elena Durazo. I admired her. I had learned about her in my Chicano studies classes, and she, had really helped turn that union around. And so I went to Unite Here Local 11. My leads at the time, my lead was this like short Oaxacan mujer. My director was this other short Oaxacan mujer. And then my other lead was like a short woman from Michoacan. Like all these short brown ladies led my team. And I was like, this is where I want to be, like with workers, like fighting back, building power. And I was there for 13 years, took a pause in between to run a health program for them. And then I just recently left, and I work right now for the Center for Popular Democracy. I'm their worker justice organizing manager. And I'm like working with unemployed workers all across the country to try to reform the unemployment system. So that's like a very summarized version of everything. But that's how I got started, what I've done. And I don't know, a bunch of stuff along the way.
No, that's a great summary, right? Like especially like I'm like, wow, like 13 years, right? Like you just like went through it in 1 minute, right? But it's part of the conversations trying to have is I want to talk to real organizers, because there's theory and then there's experience, and hopefully they meet, right, and they intersect, but that's not always the case. And I know that there's a lot of intelligent folks, a lot of people who have a lot of ideas in the social justice space, but I'm always fascinated by the folks who are actually doing the work, right? Who are, it's important to research it, it's important to theorize, but the folks who are actually on the ground, like even myself, like part of why I like having these interviews is because I'm not doing the work. So I don't really know what's going on. And it's fun for me to just like talk to people that are kind of like, oh, that's what you're doing. Cool. But yeah, like thanks for sharing that, and thanks for coming on. Since you brought up the gender identity, I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Because I wrote a piece a few months ago, Pobrecito Wow, #MeToo, and the Code of Silence. And I was talking about how I've been silent amongst other organizers who've sort of done things like whether it's like sexual abuse or been violent. And at the time, there were folks who were also, they weren't just organizers on the same campaign I was on. They were also my roommates, right? And we were friends, right? Like it's not like I don't want to distance myself and say like, no, I always knew they were bad and I did it. No, they were like homies, and I wasn't calling them out on stuff, right? So I wrote this piece where I was like, I wrote like I feel shame, and like that's an easy thing to write. Like no, like I legit like feel shame. And so I want to talk about how gender, there's like a boys club, how like these sort of things manifest in a movement. I could say like I've been complicit in it, and I want to hear like from your side, like if you've had an experience with that, like how if you've seen that around in the movement, how we deal with it, do we not deal with it, like what's just generally, like I'm happy to like go anywhere with this.
Yeah, I think in like in any space, right? In movement spaces, non-movement spaces, in any space, you're gonna encounter like issues of sexism and of like abuse of like like abuse of power and also just like weird sexual misconduct. And I kind of like wrap them all together because I think that like they all kind of fall within the same umbrella, right? Of like things that you're going to experience. And I think that like, you know, the labor movement and no organization is like immune to that, right? And I think in the same way that like everybody got woken up by the Me Too movement, so has the labor movement. And in some ways it's like a different type of challenge, right? In some ways I would say that like if you look at least the union that I worked for the majority of my time, right, it is woman led. Predominantly, if you walk into any shop steward meeting, you're going to see a bunch of women, right? Like most of our leaders are women. We always say in our campaigns, the heart of the campaigns is the housekeeping department. It's usually all women. Our directors are women. Currently, I say are, like I still work there. I don't work there anymore. I just worked there for so long, you know, like the majority of the leadership are women. And I think if you're looking at the outside, from the outside in, you would think like, oh, that's a super progressive place. They don't have any issues. But I think like any place, there is always that like struggle. And in some ways, being perceived as like super progressive makes it hard to bring up the like day-to-day, like just like struggles of like having uncomfortable conversations as a mujer, right? And, you know, I have colleagues that I have worked with for a very long time that like, you know, we had to have multiple conversations about why certain things that they did were not okay. And like, and I think things that they really just like genuinely were like blind, like they had a blind spot of like things that they would do that would make like me uncomfortable or other women are comfortable, just like stuff that they would talk about or things that they would say that's like jokes, right? And like having to have that conversation continuously was like a thing that I think most people experience, but it wasn't really like highlighted in the same way until like the Me Too movement really happened and people really started talking about these issues. And so I think it definitely exists. I definitely like encountered that. I think the difference though is like when you're an organizer, you can't, and this is like one of the places where it's like I feel like theory and organizing kind of like go in opposite directions, right? Because I think, you know, like a lot of the articles that were written at the time were just about like, well, you fuck up. Sorry, can I cuss on here?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll forget you.
Okay. Like you fucked up, like you're cut out or you're done, or like I don't want to call it cancel culture because I'm sick of like people.
Yeah.
I don't want to go down that narrative, right? But like this idea that's like, you know, like people are just like immediately shut down and when they fuck up, and people do a lot, right? And the thing as an organizer that like I was always taught is like meet people where they're at and you move them forward. And so like me just being like, well, fuck you, you're sexist and you're this and you're that, is that going to move any of those men forward? Is that going to like make them any better? And like I struggle with it a lot myself because there's like, well, it's not my responsibility to teach you not to be a fucking sexist asshole. But at the same time, as an organizer, I'm like, well, it is my responsibility to move them forward in their leadership, and them not being sexist assholes is a part of moving them forward in their leadership. So I always felt like there was like this like balance that I was trying to achieve. Like how do I make sure that I'm like helping move people forward without taking on the burden of educating them about something that they should like educate themselves. And this is just like me talking about like fellow staff members who I had a relationship with, and we like, and then because we had a relationship, we would fight it out. I had got into some like real serious like conversations with some of my colleagues to try to get them to understand why like some of the things they said were like not the best. But that's not even talking about like the members, right? Like, you know, like I've worked in the labor movement since I was really young. And so I got hit on a lot. It was like extremely inappropriate. But these are also the people that I was like trying to recruit to the committee. And so like dealing with that, like the balance of like, how do I let this person know that they're like being extremely inappropriate that I don't appreciate that, without shutting them down to the point where they're not going to open the door for me when I come back and need to recruit them to the committee, and figuring that out. And it was that, I think, was a really difficult thing to like try to like establish, like, where is the boundary where a member has gone too far and I don't actually need to be the person that goes back and knocks on their door, right? And I think like figuring that out when it's like okay for me to tell my lead, you know what, I'm not going back to that person's house. You have to send somebody else to go to their house because they make me really uncomfortable, right? And so like some of those things I think are like when you actually want to be a movement that's like actually led by workers, where your leaders are actually rank and file members. You also have to deal with the fact that that comes with a bunch of rank and file members that aren't super woke, right? Like you have some folks who have like, really antiquated belief systems, right? And like part of what we're doing is moving them into like taking leadership in their workplace, and hopefully that translates into leadership in their own lives, and hopefully that means like learning not to treat women like shit. But in the meantime, right, like how much do you put up with? And I think, I don't know that I've found that answer, right? I feel like I got to the point where I was training people and I would tolerate a very low level of it. Like if any of my female organizers felt uncomfortable, I was like, nope, you're not, okay, you don't have to go back to them. We'll find somebody else to be that person's organizer, right? But I don't know that that existed for me like when I was coming up. And I can't honestly say that it was like the people who led me or if it was me myself, me feeling like I had to go back because organizing the person was more important than anything else, right? And I think as I've like gotten older, I've learned that like that's not true, right? Like that will organizing that person is important, but it doesn't mean that I need to put myself in a situation where I'm uncomfortable to get there, right? So it's far beyond just like organized like a boys club, but it's really like how do you deal with these issues with like your own members, the own people you're trying to organize. It's like an issue that's just so pervasive, and I think we're getting better, but we're not 100, like it's not 100% there, and I don't know that it will be.
Yeah. Wow, you said so many things I want to follow up on. But to start, you said how it's harder to call this stuff out when you're viewed as like a progressive organization, or you read us like from the outside looking in. It's like, well, all the leadership is women, all these like badass women going on strike, standing up to the boss. So like obviously that's a place where like this kind of stuff isn't gonna happen. And so like there's gotta be like a disconnect, right? Where you're saying like you're working with, these short Oaxacan women who are like your leaders. You're like, this is exactly where I want to be. And at the same time, we're dealing with whether it's even colleagues or just the membership who are like not taking you seriously or acting inappropriate or whatever. So like, I don't know if you could talk a little bit more about why it's a challenge to call that out in a space like that versus in a space like a Walmart or an Amazon, right?
Yeah, I think honestly, it's like this sense of denial. And I would even say like it's like having like I still refer to like this particular place or any place, like I still work there. Like it's like a sense of denial when you work in a place that you really believe in and you believe is like truly progressive. I think you're almost like, was that sexist? Like, is it just me? Like I found myself being like, is it just me, or was that like a little bit fucked up? Right. Like, and I don't, because it's not like the overt, like, I don't know, get in the kitchen and make me a snack shit, like you question like the validity of it. So I think it's more of like you questioning it yourself, like, because like, am I really going to say, like if I talked about the union now, or most like would I say like that place was sexist? Probably not, because I do believe like, like because our leadership was so progressive, because we have so many women in leadership, because but do incidences still happen? Yes. And because it like still happen in a place that's like so progressive, I think you feel like a little bit like the disconnect is not is like also in you, like you're like kind of baffled when it happens, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like you're almost like you're questioning your own reality, like did this really just happen in this place, right? And I would just say, like, in terms of like, I don't think it was for me, at least for me personally, it wasn't as much as like I'm not taken seriously, maybe by some of the members. It was more of just like behavior that was like just like things that would make me uncomfortable. And like people not understanding why that would make me uncomfortable, you know?
Yeah.
Like the type of, you know, whatever, guy talk or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
and from the members, it was just like overt creepiness. Yeah.
Yeah. I know.
Yeah. I'm like, like
Yeah.
just men being creepy.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Standard men.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I think like when I'm thinking of like the folks I organized with, and I had to be removed 8 years before I could even like speak about it, right? When I can't like do anything about it, right? Like it's kind of, I I look back on it and I realize I was like compartmentalizing. Like I'm like, well, if they're doing this shit outside of the movement, like there was a border within what the movement is, and then there was like, well, this is just some random people outside, and so as long as they're not hurting the members, which is not even true, right? I just
Yeah.
didn't know what was going
Yeah.
on, right? Like I didn't know what the women in were experiencing, so it's not even true. I just, obviously the women weren't talking to me about it because
Yeah.
I was homies with them, so why would they talk to me about it? But even if nothing was happening on staff, right? Obviously, it's like there is no like, well, there's the inside of the movement and the outside, and like that's just like a very weird young. I was like in my 20s, you know, but yeah, no, I mean, I guess what I'm saying in that sense, I relate to like it's weird trying to talk about it, and 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 it's not picking on the union, right? Like you said, like this is something that everyone deals with. There's a problem in society. Anything you go, everybody, every job, every industry, every like movement has to deal with this stuff, right? It's everywhere.
Yeah. I think it's interesting also, like we did talk about it. We had a lot of conversations about it, which I appreciated. Like when the Me Too stuff came up, we had like also had conversations about it in the union. Like, what did this mean about the union? But I also think that as organizers, we tend to have these conversations in the context of like, what does this mean for our members, right? Like we're used to talking about sexual harassment when it comes to our members. We're used to talking like, if you talk to any female cook, right? Like she will tell you how uncomfortable it is to work in the kitchen, right? Because
Right.
cooks are like the worst. Like, I mean, I love the cooks, but when it comes to like gender issues, right? Like it's like, the kitchen is like where stuff gets like, I can tell tons of stories about like inappropriate stuff that our members got in trouble for doing in kitchens, but like we were used to talking about it in that context of like, we understand that it happens, we understand that our members can be inappropriate, we understand that like it can be an environment where women are really uncomfortable, but I think also as organizers we're just always used to talking about it in the context of like, how does this affect our members? And I think sometimes we have a hard time talking about it and like, oh, how does us also just like affect us? Like, how are we perpetuating the same things? And we did have those conversations. I don't know that we ever had them. Well, I don't know. I was gonna say, I don't know that we ever had them enough, but I don't know that you can ever have them enough, right? Like, I think this is just like a thing that if you're committed to having a workplace that is like, really striving to be free of like those types of issues, that you need to like continuously talk to each other about it and challenge each other about it, and more so than in just like the generic like, let's watch a training video and like check off a box, but really getting into like some of the conversations about it. And I will say I did have some like really incredible and personal conversations with some of like my male colleagues as we like got into it, as like I felt more comfortable being like, you know what, like the shit that you said really made me uncomfortable and this is why, and like really challenging them about it, and then like really hearing from them like what are the things about that like they didn't understand, like genuinely did not understand why like some comments they made like were offensive to me, and like really kind of like digging in. I had a lot of those conversations towards the end, and I was like appreciative of them, right? But sometimes I would talk to like, you know, fellow feminist colleagues, and they'd be like, well, you shouldn't have to do that. And I'm like, yeah, but like I'm an organizer. Like I'm used to this concept of like you meet people where they're at and you move them forward. And so it's hard for me to like reconcile those two ideas of like I shouldn't be the like I don't what you know, like people always tell me like you shouldn't have to like expend the emotional labor of having those conversations. But it kind of was like, you know, the antithesis to my other, I would say if you ask me a third way that I identify, is like I identify as an organizer, right? And so it's like to like my primary identity as an organizer, that like we like meet people where they're at, we challenge them and we move them forward. And that doesn't like make excuses for like where people are at all, but it's about like meeting them there and challenging there, and then like really being committed to having them move past that, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, if like you said, like if organizer is who you are, and organizing is all like it's 100% emotional labor. Like that's like the, so if someone tells you like you don't do the emotional labor, like that's all it is, right? Because the actual like mechanics of it is like, well, you call a member, you have a meeting, you see them in the workplace or you see them in the home, right? And you talk. That like you learn that on day one. The actual work is the real, having these real conversations that are difficult, and if everyone was like just receptive to it and already was on board, then you're not really organizing, right? Like then it's just your activists and you're getting at your activists, which is important, but organizing is getting the people who are not on board and bringing them
Yeah.
with you. So yeah, I could see how like you're like, that would be a challenge. Like how do you like my problem was compartmentalizing. You're like, I can't compartmentalize. This is who I am, and it's gonna like feed into everything. I want
Yeah.
to. Yo, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna
No.
say it just has you questioning like, um, at least for me, it had me questioning like, am I a bad feminist? Because I'm like, I read Roxane Gay's Bad Feminist to see if it was about me. But no, but like, am I, because because of my approach, right? Because I feel like like I felt the need to engage people, and I also felt like I also am like really committed to having the movement of rank and file leaders, and our rank and file leaders are flawed and problematic, and part of our job is to have them learn to take leadership and then challenge them about those things. And I'm not even just talking about gender issues, right? Our leaders have a lot of like beliefs that I completely disagreed with, right? But they were the leaders of their workplaces, and primarily I believe in like rank and file leadership and being a movement that's like driven by working people. And that means that you have to accept that working people have like these you know, different opinions and beliefs, and hopefully move towards changing them into more progressive opinions and beliefs, right? And so I often questioned whether or not like I was, I don't know, like not down enough because I was like wanting to engage in these conversations and that meant putting up with some stuff that I don't think some people would put up with, because I wanted to engage people in a conversation that would move them forward, right? And so it was like torn between that idea and like also just like, am I like harming the movement by harping on like these issues, right? Maybe some people would let them go, and probably for years they have been let go, like some of those types of conversations. And so I was constantly torn, and I'm not sure that I landed on the right thing, right? But I've kind of lived somewhere in the middle where I'm like, no, I'm gonna call out this stuff, but I'm gonna take the time to like walk people through it. Also, like I felt like, you know, I felt like I did get to a place where I had a lot of respect from the people, from the men that I worked with, and I think hearing it from me in some ways was different than just hearing it from somebody else, or hearing or seeing posts about like why stuff is problematic, but really like I think hearing like, oh, this impacts a person that I know and I respect and I hopefully care about, right? Like it means something different than just somebody writing about like why certain behaviors are problematic. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense, but
No, yeah, it does. I kind of want to. I guess part of the reason why I wanted to have this conversation too is I know what I would have wanted to see as a young organizer, like more honest conversations about like the challenges that you face, and I I how do I say this? Like, I guess I'm trying to model like who I think does this well is teachers, right? I love teachers, that teachers can just sort of, they are the #1 champions of education and students, and they're the #1 critics of it too. Teachers can just walk that line. They can tell you everything that's wrong with education and why education is important, it matters, and it needs to be funded, right? And so I'm like, we can like social movements can do that too. Like we can do that too. We can sort of see like, listen, just because we talk about what's wrong with it and the criticism doesn't mean we don't really believe it and that it's not like the best thing that should be happening, right? And I think, like you said, sometimes there's that defensiveness or like that, like, is it really happening, or doubts. Like I look at teachers as the models, right? As sort of like so you can 100% be on the program, be on board, and also be like, and these are the challenges with it. And I think that like having those honest conversations, if a young organizer like views this, right, they can have a better idea of like, at least like be like mentally prepared to a certain extent. So I guess that's like my next question, right? It's like there's a young Chicana, 20 years old, right, coming into the union. Like, what would you tell her about all this if she's expecting, like, this is a progressive space, so I don't have to deal with this stuff?
yeah, I would say that one, I don't know that any space exists where you don't have to deal with this stuff. Maybe there are some super progressive organizations out there, but if you're doing real base building, if you're doing real organizing of real communities, you're gonna encounter it. Maybe it won't be from like the people in the organization itself, but from the people that you're organizing. And so I think like the best thing is to be prepared to like, one, like call it out, and also be committed to like not helping people see through the other side, but like being committed to challenging people in like a real way. And I think challenging people in a real way means like actually engaging with people. But I don't think that there's any space where you're not really going to encounter it if you're doing real organizing work, right? Like if you could probably go work in a really progressive place where you might not encounter it, but you're not, if you're like, I just think it's like if you're engaging a big enough base, you're gonna experience that. So I think that it's going to happen. I think like one thing I wish I would have actually been told more overtly before I went in, like, hey, by the way, like members are gonna hit on you, and like this is how you should respond. Like here are some ways to respond to them when people are being inappropriate, or like if a man makes you uncomfortable, like this is like the protocol, or like because I don't think enough of that happened. And I feel like my mentors and the people in the union, at least, and I can only speak for my experience, did a great job of helping me deal with it when it happened. But I wish I had known like ahead of time, because part of it was just like me also being scared to talk about it, because I didn't want to talk shit about our own members, right? I didn't want to be like, some of it was like, shop stewards that are like really respected, but they would say stuff to me that was like real fucking creepy. And I was like, oh man, like, why do you gotta be creepy like that? Like they just led an incredible like 30-person delegation and then like told me something real creepy at the end. And I'm like, oh man, like it's so, and I wish like I had just been told like, this is gonna happen, this is how you deal with it. But also like, it's not acceptable for many of our leaders, right? And once I actually talked to people, like every time I finally like reported like this happened and it was like super creepy from our members, I always got the response of like, oh, that's not acceptable, like we need to talk to them, right? But I wish I had just been told that like from the get-go. And I think it's like, there's no amount of like anything that's worth like covering up your discomfort. And so I think that That's one thing I wish I had been told. What was there another part to your question?
No, that's yeah, just like what?
I would say, I want to say to your part of like, the teacher, like learning from the teachers, like how they criticize. I think that that's why I'm like really weary of people who criticize like labor unions, like, or that's how I give you shit sometimes. But because I kind of feel like for me, it feels kind of like, at least for my family, right? I can talk shit about my family.
Right.
Like if my family does shit that's fucked up, I will talk so much shit. But the moment anybody else who is not in my family tries to talk shit about my family, I will lose my shit. It's like, and so I that's how I feel about the union. Like I'm really protective of the union that I worked for. I'm protective of the labor movement, and I kind of feel like, okay, if you're in it, you can talk shit about it. But I have a hard time hearing other people, even if I know it's truth, and it's just really coming down to that feeling. And I think part of it for me was like when I started organizing, had no desire to work in labor. And that was partly because everything I had learned about labor, except for Maria Elena Durazo, up to that point, was that the labor movement was sexist, that the labor movement was racist, that the labor movement, like I was a Chicano studies major. So we learned about like, the United Farm Workers getting beat up by the Teamsters. Like, so I learned all of these terrible things about the labor movement. My dad was in the union growing up, but he was like not super active, and so everything that he knew about his union was like stuff that he had heard in like the news, that they're corrupt and they're stealing his money and like all of this stuff. And so I feel like sometimes that narrative gets carried out there so far that like the counter narrative isn't told, right? And so that's where my criticism comes from, right? Like I would like I would say that like, yes, some of that stuff is true, right? But there's also like, like, yes, there is sexism in the union, but I've also never found a place that empowers women more than the union, right? Like I've never, part of the reason I was in it for so long was because my favorite part of being in the union was like discovering new female leaders and seeing them like take ownership of their workplace and then like take ownership of their life. Because like once a like housekeeper learns to like fucking shout down her manager, she ain't taking shit from nobody. She's not taking shit from her husband. She's not taking shit from anybody, right? And so it's like, it has its flaws, but it's also like the best empowerment vehicle that I've ever seen, right? And so I feel like I'm very careful how I talk about it because I don't want that part to get lost, right? And I also think it's like I think it's like the best vehicle for change that we like can possibly have, like the collective power of people organizing in that way. So I know I diverted from your question. I'm sorry, but I just like when you said that, like that's what it brings to mind for me. It's like
no, I like it because right, like we're part of this like group chat, right, with organizers, and like I sent a text to the group like, hey, I'm writing this story about the lack of diversity in the leadership of unions, right? And like you were like, the to paraphrase, your response was like an eye roll, right? Like you were just like, oh great, like another think piece hating on the union.
God, I didn't know you were gonna put me on blast like this. Okay.
No, but like it forced me to really think about what I was gonna write, and like it's like what I was gonna what I was feeling versus what like actually what I thought about, and what actually like came out over several revisions, are like two different approaches, right? And it's like yeah, like how do we talk about this stuff? Where like I don't want to just do, I know that I don't want to write PR, right? I don't want to, I'm not just gonna do like, hey, well, like here's this campaign and just talk about this campaign, right? Like, because it's like that's sort of not the writing I'm doing, right? but I also, dude, like I'm talking to organizers and I'm like, because I believe in like, I think like what you guys are doing is badass, and I believe in the union, and I believe in like in workers and worker struggles. And so it's like, yeah, like where's that balance where like I don't just want to do, well, let me tell you what's wrong with the move, and it's like, and I'm not even organizing anymore, right? Like it's like I did it at 1.8 years ago, right? Like it's like, dude, like there has to be a little humility. I think like I'm teasing, saying like you did an eye roll, but I think what I took from it is like, hey dude, like take a little humility, right? And like treat this with respect. And I hope that like I tried to do that to a certain extent, but I don't know if I did, but whatever.
What's done is done. No,
It's done.
it's already out in the world.
Yeah.
I think, look, yeah, I think that it's important to have a critical view of anything that you're doing, right? And I don't think that we should, so I think you're right, right? Like I think I just have a hard time, when it comes from people who aren't directly in it. And I give you a pass because you did organize at some point, right? And so I give you a pass in that, because you have organized. And part of the reason like that I want to eventually write out myself is because I do feel like not enough organizers write about what it means to organize and how to organize and all of that stuff. So part of the reason I agreed to do this interview, although very reluctantly, was because I do think people need to hear from actual organizers doing the work. And so I appreciate you asking me to be on. And yeah, I think that like it's hard to talk about because like I think that like I can actually talk about like pinpoint what the fear is. Like the fear is that like somebody will like take your criticism out of context and use it to attack the thing that you've spent years trying to build up.
Yeah.
Right? Like my worst fear would be like, former organizer says that the union is sexist, which is like not the point of, you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
and because I spent years trying to build up this place, who I think ultimately stands for way much more than that. But like every other institution has those same issues, right? Like it has like the issues that any place that you go to will have, right? And so I think that's where the fear comes from of like, do I want to criticize this thing because it's so hard to build it, right? Like it's so hard to build up organizing, but it's so easy to tear it down.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where it comes from.
And that's like a legit ass fear, especially in this space of like alternative facts and like Twitter trolls and stuff. It's like it happens every day, right? So it is. That's like that's a legit fear, right? And I mean that might happen. That might happen with this, right? Like not to be like, but it's not in our control, right? Like what's this out? Like it might happen. But I also trust that like every time there's been like I've seen like a troll and like someone like spouting stuff that's straight up is easily disproven, I've always seen people like counter it, right? I've always seen people like stand up to it and be like, nope, that's not true, you're taking this out of context, whatever. So I also trust, so I think it's likely that people will take stuff out of context, but I also think that like people will stand up and fight for it. I trust that people will do that.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is a good spot. I think, we talked about all the criticisms, even though we didn't want to criticize. No, you said, right, these are difficult conversations, right? And I think
Difficult conversations.
difficult conversations, yes. So thank you for doing this.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.